Hey everybody, Steve Antonioni, Oni here to talk about how to prepare your financial life for a potential recession, because they can be very financially damaging, and unfortunately that might be what's ahead of us. So the very first thing I want to talk about today is something that does have very good predictive power when it comes to recessions, and that is the yield curve inversion. Now, I have talked about this in a previous video in detail, so if you want to check that out, go ahead, but I'm going to give you the quick version today. So, what the heck is a yield curve inversion? Well, it's pretty simply put by this chart in front of you right here. So the main things you want to pay attention to on this chart are the middle zero line, obviously the blue line running across the chart, as well as these gray bars. Now, what do all these different things represent? Well, the gray bars represent recessions. So anytime you see these, it means that the economy has experienced a recession. And I'm going to be defining what exactly a recession means later in this video. But you can see the two most recent ones we've had are from COVID and the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. So they're not good things that happen in the economy. Prior to all of these recessions, going all the way back to 1980, you can see that this blue line on the chart has dipped below the zero line. Every time that has happened, a recession soon follows after. When the blue line on this chart goes below the zero line, that represents what is known as a yield curve inversion. And if you look up to the present date, you can see that the blue line is heading towards that exact point. Now, according to a report from the Federal Reserve of San Francisco, forecasting future economic developments is a tricky business. But the term spread, aka what we're looking at right here, has a strikingly accurate record for forecasting recessions. Periods with an inverted yield curve are reliably followed by economic slowdowns and almost always by a recession. So, like I said earlier, this particular economic indicator is very reliable for letting us know if a recession is likely to be coming at us. And just to hammer home that point, in their report directly from the Federal Reserve themselves, they show that every recession since 1955 has been preceded by a yield curve inversion. And you can see that once again on this chart as well. All the gray bars here are recessions. And right before them, you can see that the blue line has dipped below the zero line. All right, so it's pretty clear that a yield curve inversion is an excellent predictor of a coming recession. But this is probably going to prompt a few questions from you, like what the heck is a yield curve? How fast does a recession actually arrive? And what actually is a recession in the first place? Well, first of all, a super simple way to think about the yield curve is that it has three basic shapes, okay? There's upward sloping, there's flat, and there's downward sloping. So an upward sloping curve signals that the economy is perceived to be healthy and functioning smoothly. A flat curve signals that the economy is perceived to be more relatively uncertain and that it may be actually slowing down. And then finally, a downward sloping curve signals that the economy is in trouble and actively can contribute to economic slowdowns. So this third stage here corresponds with yield curve inversions. Currently, we're at the second stage. We are at a flat curve, and the risk is that we could move on to this next stage, the downward sloping curve. Now, if we return to the chart from earlier, the zero line here represents a completely flat curve. Like once the blue line touches the horizontal zero line, that means that the curve is flat. So remember, that represents uncertainty and potential slowing down in the future. Now, anything below the zero line, this represents stage 3, a downward sloping curve and a yield curve inversion. So this chart from the Federal Reserve gives us a very good idea of how close we are to that. So basically, we are in the process of flattening and potentially headed for that inversion. All right, so we are close, and if we did in fact invert how soon could we expect to see a recession? Well, when a yield curve inverts, recessions don't normally show up immediately. They actually take about 6 to 24 months to materialize based on the data since 1955. So even though I'm talking about this today in a proactive sense, the yield curve has not actually inverted yet, and even if it did, an official recession might not occur for a year or two after that. But I wanted to start this conversation about this ever-increasing possibility now because I believe it's much better to prepare for something like this well in advance, because recessions can be very economically damaging. But what are we actually preparing for? And what is a recession? Like, what's the actual definition of a recession? What does that even mean? And how can it actually affect us? Well, the term recession gets thrown around quite a bit, but the official definition of a recession in the United States is actually determined by this particular body, and they're called the National Bureau of Economic Research, and their criteria is as follows: a significant decline in economic activity spread across the economy lasting more than a few months, normally visible in real GDP, real income, employment, industrial production, and wholesale retail sales. Now, that was definitely quite the definition, and some parts of that definition might appear to be a little bit vague. But the most important points, I think, here are that the economy must slow significantly, it must last more than a few months, and the Bureau calls a recession retroactively. So while we may be living in a recession or through a recession, we won't know if it's actually technically a recession until possibly like a year or more later. So that's why I prefer to be aware in advance, because recessions can be, like I said, particularly harmful. Like, think of the last two recessions we had, COVID and the Great Financial Crisis. Those were very damaging to people. Now, the reason that economic slowdowns are harmful is because the economy essentially works like this. You basically have a circle between production, compensation, and spending. So when I spend money, I'm funding the production of more goods and services in the economy. This then leads to increased earnings for companies, which then allows me to receive more income for my work. And then this cycle can then repeat. Now, in a super simplified sense, this is how a healthy economy can grow and provide more abundance for everyone. But for various reasons, like a supply shock or conflict, one or more parts of the economy can slow down. So let's say that businesses are forced to raise prices. Well, now you might spend less money because things are more expensive. But if you spend less money, then that means that businesses earn less money, which then means that you get paid less money. So once again, in a super simplified sense, this is how an economy can actually slow down. It's a feedback loop that can work in a positive sense as well as in a negative sense. So in a recession, this negative feedback loop is occurring, which can result in less pay, higher prices, less jobs, lost jobs, and lower asset values and more negative things like that. Oftentimes, recessions force people into very difficult situations where they're forced to do things like take on debt. And if you've ever been put in a situation like that, then it may have caused you to do something like harm your credit score. And if that has happened, then you may want to check out today's sponsor, Neo. In addition to their excellent savings account and their excellent standard credit card, which I use, Neo also has a cash secured card, which Credit Card Genius calls the best cash secured card in Canada. This is a great card for anyone who has struggled with their credit history or building credit, because you'll be guaranteed to be approved for this card with as little as a $50 deposit. That is unheard heard of. On top of that, there's no annual fee and you'll get all the same great perks as their standard credit card, including up to 5% cash back. So if you're someone who's looking to build, rebuild, or establish their credit, check out the link in the description down below for the Neo Secured credit card. Now, it would be great if we could just avoid all the negative implications of recessions or just avoid recessions altogether, but unfortunately, that's just not possible. They seem to come like clockwork. So instead, I think that we can do our best to prepare for them. And let's talk about how to do that with this 4-step framework that I've put together. Step 1, increase liquidity. Now, liquidity is probably a strange term if you've never really heard that before, or if you don't know what that is. So basically, liquidity it's kind of just a fancy finance term for how easy it is for you to have spendable cash if you need it. So for example, let's put it this way. This is an extreme example, by the way. If I had $0 in my bank account, but 10 homes, I would be in a very illiquid situation because it would be very hard for me to get cash because it's quite a process to sell a home. If I had a bill come due today, I would not be able to pay that bill because I wouldn't be able to just immediately sell my home, convert it into cash, and then pay that expense. So basically, if you want to know how liquid something is, just ask yourself how fast you can spend it. How fast can I spend a home? Well, not fast at all. How fast can I spend cash? Very fast. How fast can I spend something like stocks? Moderately fast. It's kind of in between. So the reason it's a good idea to think about how liquid you are prior to a recession is because the more liquid that you are, the more prepared you will be to handle bad events like a lower income or a lost job. Now, the easiest way to increase your liquidity is to have an emergency fund, which is generally recommended to be 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses. But personally, I go with 1 year's worth of living expenses stashed away in a high interest savings account. So essentially what you're doing here is you're just increasing your cash position relative to all the other things that you might own or relative to any debt obligations that you have. You're just increasing the amount of cash you have on hand, which then increases your liquidity and allows you to handle or better handle any type of unforeseen negative event. Step 2, decrease high interest debt. One of the worst things you can have going into a recession is high interest debt. And that's because the force of compound interest works on debt the same way it works on investments. So, you know how you might think about investing your money in the stock market and think to yourself, wow, I can invest this money, earn something like 7% per year on average, and it's going to just grow into this huge amount and I'm going to be rich. That same force is also acting on your debt. So if you have debt that has a rate of 7% or even higher than that, it's going to grow the same way. Investing your money in the stock market can make you rich. High interest debt can make you very poor. The other big problem with debt is it creates an expense that you have to pay periodically. In a recession, when you're facing the potential of lower income or lost income, you generally want to eliminate as many of these periodic expenses as possible. So personally, I would take a look at any debt that I have, and then anything with an interest rate over 7%, I would be making a plan to figure out how I'm going to be paying that off sooner rather than later. Step 3, build income security. So the next thing I would look at and basically ask myself is, how secure is my income? I think COVID showed us that a lot of jobs and careers and industries that we thought were probably relatively stable and secure actually weren't. So there's a few tough questions that I would definitely ask myself, like, how valuable is my position at work? How can I make myself more valuable? Do I have skills that transition well to other jobs or industries? And is it possible for me to create another income stream? Now, personally, I began creating a new career path prior to COVID hitting. And once COVID hit, I ended up essentially switching and then going full on into this other career path. And now I'm actually earning more than I was at my previous career. Step 4, cutting back. So this is obviously something that nobody wants to do, but it becomes increasingly important in difficult economic times. So essentially what this means, at least to me, is reducing or eliminating spending on unnecessary things or luxury things. But I think the degree to which you do this is predicated upon the rest of your kind of holistic financial picture. If you're in a very strong financial position, then that might mean that you don't have to do this at all. But if you are somebody who isn't very liquid, who does have high interest debt, who doesn't have a very secure income, then I would personally be trying to eliminate as much of this stuff as possible. So that's my 2 cents on the current economic outlook and what the yield curve is telling us. Remember that this is all in preparation for a potential scenario. Nothing is set in stone. And if the yield curve were to actually invert, remember that it generally takes a period of 6 to 24 months for a recession to actually show up. So this is all just good practice preparation. I'm not trying to like fearmonger or anything like that. But I'll be continuing to keep my eye on the yield curve and will provide updates as everything continues to progress. Fingers crossed we can avoid a bad outcome, but like I said, never hurts to make room for that possibility. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you didn't mind today's setup too much. I actually was recording a podcast recently with some new friends, so this was the setup I had for that. So I thought, hey, why don't I just make my next video with this as well? So let me know if you actually kind of like this, and maybe I could do it again. See you again soon.